Welcome to another Caroline Glick Show. We've been seeing some sort of weird things have been exposed about Israeli society over the past 7 months since the left began their anti-government protests in earnest with the installation of the swearing in of the Netanyahu government. One of the things that has been most striking has been the leading role that veterans from the 1973 Yom Kippur War have played in leading some of the most violent aspects of the demonstrations and the most intolerant aspects of the demonstrations, and it's really been remarkable. These are people in their 70s, sometimes in their 80s, and they're at the forefront as veterans of the Yom Kippur War, which we're going to mark its 50th anniversary in just a month. So I thought that the person to speak to about this week is Professor Elisha Haas. Elisha Haas, first of all, welcome to the Caroline Glick Show.
Yes.
Elisha Haas, do you guys know, he's the professor of biophysics at Bar-Ilan University. He was for many, many years the head of a very important organization here called Professor for Strong Israel. And most importantly for our purposes today, he was also a company commander in a mechanized infantry brigade during the Yom Kippur War, where he served. He was called up on the day of the war as a reservist, and he was in Syria and in Golan Heights until Passover, I think. So, first of all, you've written a bunch of articles over the past several years about what happened to Zionists as a result of that. And one of the things that you noted in an article that you sent me that I was looking over on Shabbat was that you came home on a furlough from the war at a certain point to your kibbutz Eliyahu, and you met with an educator of yours named Eliezer Goldman, I think, and you asked him what he thought about the war, and he said that this war is a death knell of socialist Zionism, which was a pretty profound statement to make at the height of the war, or in its immediate aftermath. Can you just explain this a little bit? What was he talking about?
I want to understand. Eliezer Goldman was a real scholar, and I was privileged to be his student in high school. He insisted on being a farmer, not a professor. And when we got to the time of high school, so the kibbutz told him, "You should now be a teacher." And I was privileged to be his student. So he was a socialist. And his answer was so sharp. And it's clear to me a paradox that I faced on that day. Because after the first 3 weeks of the battles of Yom Kippur, my battalion was taken from Syria to the Golan Heights in order to reorganize. And one night I collected the company and we had a fire and people talked, and I realized the morale is very high. The people who were under fire, some of their friends were dead, some were wounded. They felt that we succeeded, we rescued our homeland, and we did it. Then we sent every night 2 people home, and in the morning they came back, and 2 other people went home to see the family. Everybody who came back from Tel Aviv, from Haifa, said, Tel Aviv is in depression. So the soldiers who suffered the fire were in high morale, but the civilians were in depression. So why? This is a paradox. So the reason was that depression was not because of the loss of the war, because the war was won. It was because of the very existence of the war on Yom Kippur. And what Eliezer told me is that this is the end of socialist Zionism. Socialist Zionism came to exist because of one failure, the failure of emancipation. That was one of the motivation, of the reasons that pushed socialism. Now, the Ben Gurion formulation.
Elisha, let me just give a little background. So the thing with emancipation for people who are less familiar is that Napoleon, he issued sort of the Emancipation Proclamation for the Jews of Europe, where he said, you are accepted as citizens of France, and then in the countries that France conquered under his leadership. And the condition is that you're allowed to be a citizen and have full rights and integrate into the civic life of this country, but you have to keep your Judaism in the house. Basically, Judaism is supposed to stop being a nationality and a separate and distinct identity. Judaism from now on will be more like Christianity. You go to your synagogue, we go to our church, and we're all come out of our house and we're French together. And this was a huge promise for the Jews, particularly in Western and Central Europe, but it didn't end hatred of Jews. It transferred the hatred from anti-Judaism to anti-Jews and as a race. And so the concept of anti-Semitism was invented in the mid-1900s as a response to the emancipation. We didn't want Jews either. It wasn't the problem that they were wearing primals and they were living in ghettos. It was that they existed as people, and so they recreated Judaism, the haters of the Jews, as Semites, and so we're anti-Semites, we hate the Jews as a race, and that was sort of the beginning of the Holocaust. That was the end of the failure of the emancipation led to two things. Led on the one hand the Holocaust, and on the other hand socialist Zionism. Okay, with that background.
So the solution to the problem was, let's go to a place where we shall be an ethnic group, independent, and will be accepted as a normal group. And the idea was to create the new Jew. The new Jew will be different from the Jews of Europe and the Jews of the diaspora. It will be not committed to the practices of the Jewish tradition. It will be socialist. There will be an elite groups and who will establish new settlements that will practice some new ideas. And the new Jew, one of the principles was, here there will be no pogroms, because we are farmers, we are soldiers, we fight. There will be no pogroms. That was the generation of Ben Gurion. And the Six-Day War showed that it works, because there was a fear of a pogrom, and then the Jews won the war, and then they ignored the war of attrition. It was ignored, the war of attrition. The war of 68-69. But then came Yom Kippur. And what happened in Yom Kippur? On the holy day, two major foreign armies attacked the Jews, and within 3 weeks, about 2,200 Jews dead, young men dead. So it was perceived as a classic pogrom. And then
let me just stop one more time. I want to interject one thing here, just so you guys understand the dimensions, because it's hard for people who weren't there, like myself, really, to understand the shock that happened. So just a little story from my husband, who was 13 in Jerusalem during the war. And he said, Caroline, you don't understand. It was like an assembly line at Mount Herzl Military Cemetery. It was just, dozens, hundreds of people getting, on an assembly line in funerals all of the time. He said it started, the initial shock of war, and then a week later or so, the funeral started, and you had never seen anything like it before. Just families being called, and they're in a state of shock, and they have to go, and there are other families waiting, and there are funerals taking place simultaneously. And of course, what happened in Jerusalem happened in Tel Aviv, happened in Haifa, happened in the kibbutzim, happened everywhere. So it was this kind of stunning, amazing, shocking, horrible experience that people throughout the country were going through with these just, today when a soldier is killed, you have, a televised funeral and everybody comes together. And here you had hundreds of people who were being killed every day, and they all had to be buried at the same time. It was a disaster.
People didn't know that every day. People knew it only later. after 3 weeks. That was a shock when it turned out that we have many casualties, but we won. On the other hand, Yom Kippur, the 6-day war and the war of attrition had 1,800 casualties. It was not shocking. It was accepted as the price of being independent. So what happened in Yom Kippur? In Yom Kippur, it was the shock of the surprise and the attack on the holy day and the concentrated loss. And then people said, in Kishinev there was a pogrom, and here there was a pogrom. What did Zionism achieve? Nothing. That was the end of socialist Zionism. Because if we came here in order to avoid pogroms, we failed. So there were 2 vectors created at the end of the first part of the Yom Kippur War, the 3 weeks. One said there was a pogrom, so Zionism failed. So let's go back to a new ghetto, which is the seashore. Forget about the ideas of settlement. Forget about the ideas of being safe. Let's ask the Goyim to give us peace. That was a conclusion. That is when peace now started. This is the vector of retreat. But other people like me said, well, we were attacked and we ended the war near Cairo and near Damascus. My company was for a while the closest company to Damascus. We were inside Syria, and that means Zionism succeeded. So let's go on and start settlements and start expand. And that was the beginning of Gush Emunim. These are 2 vectors in 2 opposite directions that will never meet. And that is the beginning of the 40 years of struggle, which we are facing
Let
now.
me just stop you one last second here, because I think this is a key point, that they're 2 separate vectors that just went off in opposite directions. And what's weird here, right? Not weird, but notable, and I just want to stop here for a second to discuss it, is that, again, Americans look at the Yom Kippur War. It's taught in American military academies, particularly the tank battles in the Sinai, as one of the most important and striking military victories in human history in land warfare. And yet Israelis, and I was stunned by this, when I made Aliyah, looked at the Yom Kippur War. The people in the universities, in the army, and other places looked at it as a loss, and it isn't studied in Israeli military academies the way that it's studied at Fort Leavenworth and other American military academies. And it's very, very notable, because it's like, sorry that we won, or we didn't win, we lost, and this idea, the shattering of the secular Zionist side, on the socialist Zionist side, that it was. This brings us really to what you were talking about the changing of the guard, from the first generation of the Zionist founders to the generation of the sons, because, of course, 1% of the population was killed, 6,500 people, 6,500 soldiers in the War of Independence in 48-49. And here, 2,200, 2,600, I thought, were killed in Yom Kippur. And yet the parents' generation could see that as a victory despite the extraordinary cost, and the sons recoiled from it and said, we lost when they won.
In order to understand that, we have to understand 2, maybe 3 questions. One is cultural changes and also political changes occur at the change of generations. A generation is 40 years, like our forefathers in the desert, because the influence of a cultural generation can span over 40 years. The first generation was the Ben Gurion generation. This was a very privileged generation because they had a strong Jewish identity. Every one of them came from a cheder or a yeshiva. They did not practice the Jewish tradition, but they were Jewish. And therefore they fought. They destroyed 300 Arab villages without any any moral deliberation. They built 250 new settlements on the ruins of the Arab, and nobody asked the question. It was clear. We have a mission, and the mission is to build a Jewish state. But the second generation, and the change of generation occurred in the 70s. Incidentally, Yom Kippur War was also, in the Talmud terms, Yom Kippur War was Makaba Patish, a hammer strike that made the change much stronger. I remember Ben Gurion passed away when I was in Syria in the end of 73, maybe beginning of 74. Now, the failure of the first generation, the generation that invented the new Jew, is that they did not understand that Jewish identity is a morasha, is a tradition, and not genetics. And therefore, since they did not educate the second generation to accept the principle of Jewishness, even if they are not practicing, the second generation was a generation without the Jewish identity. And therefore, immediately after the war, they asked the question, what are we doing here? Why are we here? Why should we fight? And for what are we fighting? Why fight for land? Land is only soil and stones. Why should we come to the Temple Mount? It's only stones. This is the second generation. And this generation did not accept the mission of a Jewish state. And it was like Shavshevet, how do you say in English? Yes, that does not have its own direction, but follows the direction of the wind that comes from the west or from the north and change direction. This generation became a servant of the foreign forces and was not able to cope with the mission of Jewish state. And here begins the problems that we had. Now, instead of analyzing the situation and understanding what happened and trying to solve the problem, they covered the problem. And I give you some signs. First of all, the IDF did not research the war of Yom Kippur. I personally was a company commander. We lost 4 people in the company and some others. And there were days in the war that I was alone. And nobody knows what happened with my company, even not the battalion commander. Nobody came to ask me what happened because nobody wanted to learn what happened. This is a symptom of the fact that we are not going to solve the problem. We are going to ignore it. And I for myself, I did a personal research. I did an analysis. I wrote a paper in which I wrote my success, my failure, and criticism, and what should I learn from that. I have this for 50 years now. I did it in Syria immediately after the first battles. I never read it again. I have it here. This happened to everybody else. And now there is a period that many people are recording their memories. People who were fighting at that time. And also, I was in the Golan recently and saw many new sites of memory. What happened? My generation, people are getting 70 to 80 years old, and they say nobody asked us what happened, so we have to tell what happened in that war. Now, this is a symptom, but what really happened is that instead of strengthening the Jewish state, the second generation, which did not get the Jewish mission, the mission of Jewish state, was working to create the non-Jewish state in order not to suffer the anti-Semitism that became anti-Zionism. And you remember the 1975 declaration of the UN General Assembly. Now,
wait, Elisha, can I just stop you 1 second? I just want to stop you 1 second. I just want to interject here one thing, which I started, my last question, I went in one direction. I just want to go back for a second to the other direction, which is the end of 73. And you said that there were two vectors that left that war. And one was the vector that saw the extraordinary success as a defeat because they looked at it and said, wait a minute, we're still hated, even though we're not Jews anymore, we're Israelis. We created this new Jew, we called it Israeli, and we're not supposed to suffer the same hatred. And so since the Israeli thing doesn't get rid of the problem, then what we really want to do is just ask for mercy from our enemies. Let's make peace. We'll give you everything that we took in war in 67 and just be nice to us. And sort of, you wrote in this article that they basically said, okay, then if this doesn't work, then all that works is the ghetto. Let's recede to a ghetto. It'll be in Israel. We'll speak Hebrew, but leave us alone and we'll just do our thing. So it was this kind of constricting. And since they had no Jewish cognizance from the outset because their parents didn't teach it to them, they also, not only did they want a ghetto, but they also became extremely anti-Jewish because they blamed their fate on their Judaism, or more to the point, on Jews who didn't want to do like they were doing or weren't raised as they were, as secular Hebrew speakers with no real connection to their past because their parents told them to bury the past. And on the other hand, the second vector said, we just won, like you and your comrades, and let's move on. This is okay. It was hard. It was a test, but we passed this test, and let's keep going with the Zionist project because it triumphed just now in the Golan, in the Sinai, etc. Let's move on from our victory, from strength to strength. And you said that they never met. Was there an opportunity that was missed to try to have that conversation back in 73? Could something, if the army had examined what had happened, do you think that history would have looked differently? What was the relationship between the two sides from the beginning that made it impossible, or it never came up in conversation actually even have that discussion now, which as we're going to see as we move forward, is really what you claim, that I think are correctly lays at the heart of what we're experiencing 50 years later. Why wasn't that conversation had in 73?
Because there was no common interest to meet. The situation was very complicated. I have to make one explanation. The Zionism and the return to Israel, Shivat Zion, is against nature. It cannot happen in a natural way. It has to be supported by a force that is external to nature. Every attempt to turn upside down a natural process can happen only by a force that is external to the system. And the external force for the Zionism, for the Shivat Zion, was the Jewish identity, which the first generation had. And now it was lacking. Now, in Yom Kippur War, everybody was fighting. There was a huge sacrifice, huge, by everybody, all parts of the Israeli society. And that was the second generation. It was only after the war that they asked, okay, what's now? And here, everything separated. We were fought together. People who are now on both sides were in the same tank. And there's no question about that. We are together and we are now united. The split was when looking at the outcome of the war and understanding it. It was understood in two opposite ways, and there was no basis for discussion. Now, the next step was Oslo. Oslo was born on Yom Kippur, on the last day of Yom Kippur War. It took them a long time, but in the 80s, I was a member of a group led by Professor Avraham Wachman from the Technion that that proposed a long-term plan for Israel and Judea and Samaria. He started it because he was serving as a sergeant in reserve as a planning part of IDF. And he was shocked to see that they are planning only for next year, no long-term planning. So he prepared a plan, and in 1976 he met with Rabin and offered him the plan and said, Rabin, we don't need a plan. We are doing today what we need today to do. We built in Ophira, we built in Sinai, we are okay. So Wachman gave up. But when I met him, I was in the 80s, I was on sabbatical in MIT, and he was there also. So we met incidentally, said, so why are you sitting? Let's go. So when we came back, we started an association, and we met with all politicians and tried to convince them. One of our meetings was with the Institute of Strategic Studies of Tel Aviv University. The head of the institute was Aaron Yariv, the late Aaron Yariv, which I admired as... Yes. And what they explained to us is that we are like the French in Algeria. That was the theme. That was the tournament. And Shlomo Gazit asked us, why do we insist on Gush Etzion? So Wachman was so shocked that he said, Kacha. We don't need to explain it. But that was the spirit. And the summary of the discussion after 3 hours was by Aaron Yariv, and he said, and it's still resonating in my ears. He said, we are weak. We have to give Arafat what he wants and hope that he will give us security arrangements.
That's exactly what you heard from Aaron Yariv, who was, I think, also the head or the deputy head of military intelligence, right? So what you heard from Yariv is what the IDF says, right? They say there's no military solution, but your job is to find military solutions. That's what a military does, is that it solves military problems. And we have this military problem, for instance, in Lebanon with Iran's proxy force Hezbollah. Solve it. But they instead, we have, I mean, from the time Ehud Barak was chief of staff when I was in the IDF, and certainly from him until today, the mantra in the IDF is there's no military solution. But then what do we have you for? Why do we buy you all these shiny new tanks? I mean, solve it, right? And so what you heard from him is exactly the kind of defeatism that's been emanating from the IDF, at least so long as I've been involved.
That was 4 years before Oslo. But that was the intellectual backing of Oslo. But Oslo was born in Yom Kippur. It was a direct outcome. And the aim was to create the ghetto.
Yossi Beilin was in the Sinai in Yom Kippur. I mean, he was, right? He stopped being religious as a result of Yom Kippur, and he became this radical peacenik, I think, after the war.
Yes. Now, let me also make one statement. The victory in Yom Kippur was only by the lower ranks of the people, what we call the Kav Adam, the blood lion, people who were under fire. Because people sucked. Yes, the government failed, the top command of the IDF failed, and the government was defeated. I was furious when in June 1974, we gave back the territory in Syria to the Syrians together, and we added Quneitra and the Rapid area because Kissinger demanded that. It's absurd that an army that is victorious gives its own land to the enemy. And this symbolizes the situation of the government. Golda Meir did not have the right to negotiate. She had to resign right away and let somebody else who was not defeated do the negotiation. Anyway, we came to the situation that Oslo was a way out of the problem, not to solve the problem, but to run away from the problem. And they knew that it's not a solution. They knew it. They were desperate. And because they were desperate, they created an imaginary situation and were acting in the imaginary situation and not in reality. But then, of course, reality met us and Oslo failed. But then it turned out that Oslo had another intention. And the intention it was when they identified the only obstacle to turning Israel into a normal state, a state that is like any other state without the Jewish mission. And this enemy are the settlers, the people who took the second vector. Instead of adopting a joint vector, they tried to destroy our vector. And it failed. Then they identified that the enemy or the obstacle is the political power of the national religious people who are the main body of the settlers. Again, they tried to destroy that vector, and that is the disengagement. The disengagement was an intention to destroy the political power of the people of the expansion vector. No negotiation, no attempt.
The disengagement was in 2005. It was 18 years ago this month. And it was the expulsion of the Jews from Gaza and from northern Syria.
The plan was not Gaza. The plan was Judea and Samaria.
Right.
And Ehud Olmert went to election in March 2006, and the plan was to evacuate settlements in Judea and Samaria. When Olmert was interviewed right after the statistical result of the election, they asked him, "What do you say?" He said, "I want to live in a normal state, but it is a pleasure to live." He didn't say a Jewish state, and that's not accident, because that's exactly the vector of retreat. And luckily he went to the Second Lebanon War, and the second disengagement was cancelled. That was a miracle. Now they had again how to fight the vector of Zionism. Then they took two political passes. One is Aaron Barak should destroy the coalition of the Jews. And how to do it? Destroy the head of the coalition, which is Netanyahu. And they sent Bennett as a Trojan horse into the political party of the vector to destroy it from inside. He did it. And now we see that on November 1st last year, when it was clear that the party called National Religious Party, the new Tzionut Datit, got 14 seats, it was a shock. Because the party that was supposed to be dead is existing and expanding. And that was the beginning of the quarrel now, of the fight now. On that night, the artillery of the how do you call it, as a demonstration?
They launched the protest, the insurgency, launched their first artillery strike against the Netanyahu government.
The artillery started shooting that night. And the reason was not the coalition, not the judicial reform, not at all. It was not. It was the fact that they failed to destroy the second vector, the vector on the other side. And what we are facing now is that the people who were fighting, second generation, people who do not want a Jewish state, were shocked to see that most of the people are not with them. Why? because the most important process, there were three processes that changed the Jewish society in Israel. One is the strength, the increase of traditionality, not religious, traditional. The people who have Jewish identity, who are not in conflict with the synagogue, they go to synagogue, but they also go to football on Shabbat afternoon. This is the most important process that occurred in Israel in 20 years. And it's not in response to the second vector. It is in response to the question, what are we doing here? Without the Jewish identity, which is a force that is external to nature, we cannot survive here. People understand it, and people are becoming with more commitment to the Jewish mission, with different levels of practicing the Jewish tradition. That is the process that changed the proportion in the Israeli society, and now the people of the vector of Zionism are 64 mandates, and the others are only 46. It is a very big difference, and that is a decisive result. And therefore, the people of the second generation, those who were fighting together with us 50 years ago, now they have their last chance to avoid acceptance of the vector that they don't like. They want to preserve the situation as they did it for 40 years using the Supreme Court and using the deep state. So the Likud governments were paralyzed by the people who wanted the retreat.
Let me just give a little bit of background to what you're saying. So what you are saying is that, because we're covering so much ground in 1 hour, so it's easy to just sort of jump forward. The thing is that in 77, Likud won elections for the first time, and Aaron Barak was appointed Attorney General, I think, in 78 by Menachem Begin, and it was at that time that we started seeing a transfer of governing power from the government, which had always been one with the bureaucracy, because it was all the same. It was all the same party. It was all Mapai of Ben Gurion or the Labor Party, and they controlled everything. The minute that the Likud came in, what the people in the permanent state and the bureaucracy started doing was that they were absconding, and it was led by Aaron Barak. They were absconding. They were taking the powers of the elected leaders and giving it to themselves, so that, Ben Begin or his ministers would come and they would make a plan, and then the bureaucracy would say, well, can't do that. Impossible. It's never been done. Or later on, it's illegal. And they were just making things up to try to paralyze, whether it was in Judea and Samaria or economic policies, whatever it happened to be, educational policies. Nope, can't do that. So that you had a permanent bureaucracy that you couldn't fire because we were socialists and everything else. And so that was what happened for 40 years. But over the period of 40 years, from 77 on forward, you had increasing disaffection on the part of Likud voters, or voters for the right religious bloc that Likud leads, from this position, because they became more extreme over time. And the public, more and more sectors of the public began becoming personally harmed, directly harmed and damaged by what they were doing, whether in the courts or in the bureaucracy. And so for the first time in Israeli history, on November 1st, you had an absolute majority, not just for the right religious bloc, but for the right religious bloc running together on a platform of curbing the permanent state led by the Supreme Court. And that's why this is the last gasp, because for 40 years, with the right ostensibly in charge politically, but actually paralyzed operationally, the left could accept a situation that they were the minority. But now that the majority says, wait a minute, no, we no longer accept it. And here you also go to the fact that this is also, just as 73 was the second generation, now we're seeing the third generation.
Exactly. And this is the second process that occurred. In the past 10 years, we have beginning of the third generation. The third generation is a different generation. It's a generation that says no more. No, you cannot block us. you are using the NIF, the New Israel Fund, in order to destroy the society from inside. No, you control us, no more. And you can see it symbolized by the young man from Kiryat Shmone who went to the gate of Kibbutz Kfar Giladi and said, "You were blocking Kiryat Shmone? You put 250 cars in the center of Kiryat Shmone to avoid us from going to shopping and to schools? No more, no more, forget. You do not control us anymore. Now we control you, we block your gate." This is the change. And we have new leadership, younger people in the Knesset, like Yariv Levin, Simcha Rotman, Shlomo Kari, and Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, who are different. We have a different generation. The third process is that people understand that they were cheated. And the peace process is an action in an imaginary situation. It's not real. And forget about it. We have to be strong, and we have to depend only on our strength. And nobody will help us. Nobody helped us in Yom Kippur, neither the Americans, nor anybody else. And we have to be strong and believe in our mission. These are the three processes that change the situation. And therefore, the fight now is between people who want to preserve the abnormal situation that was in the past and those who want to start a new Jewish mission to build the state of Israel.
But let me just challenge you here a little bit, because you say that in physics there's a rule that says that you can't change the normal processes of things without an external force coming in and pushing events in an opposite direction from the natural patterns. And so for the Zionist movement, for the Jewish people, it was Judaism. That Judaism itself it rejects the natural processes and goes in a completely different direction. And I think you talked about it in a Zoom conversation that you had, which I'd love to get into if we have time, but I just want to throw it out there now, which is that you were saying that the Code of Hammurabi basically is a code of rights. It says these are the rights that you have vis-a-vis the leader. And the Jewish law is a code of responsibilities, of duties that you have, so that it's a very, very different.
The duties are to the Almighty,
to God. So when exactly, so that this
you are not
this
allowed
is
to
right. So this is totally a clash. This is a complete existential clash between the individualism, the hyper individualism that you have, that's just running roughshod over Western civilization today, where people are atomized to the point where, my personal preferences as whatever I wanted to, describe myself as, are supposed to dictate the realities of everybody else, who has to respect whatever my personal preferences are as one atom in a larger organism, which is a human society. And so you made this point, but here the left would say, so if the externality of the Jewish revolution, of the Zionist movement, is Judaism, then the left's external force is America, right? It's this idea that Arle Yariv gave to you in the 1980s that says we're weak. Well, all the objective reality shows, no, actually, we're strong. Look at what we just did. Look at what we've accomplished in the 35 years or whatever, or 45 years, or whenever it was, that Israel had been existing at that point when you had that meeting with him. But the army today and the elites that are on the street today, your comrades from 50 years ago who are leading the charge today, are saying, no, we're weak. We can't survive. The former consul general to New York, Asaf Zamir, said on Channel 12 when he came back to Israel that we're a vassal state of the United States. We can't stand up to the Americans. We have to do what they say. So they're saying that the external force is America, or sometimes the Europeans, and that they're compelling us to be non-Jewish. They're compelling us to be a post-Jewish state, to live in a ghetto on the coastal plain, and that we're not allowed to win anything. So that's their external force. It's like the world outside, and the majority of Israeli Jews are saying, no, our world is our Judaism is our Jewish heritage, and that's what has enabled our survival across time, and that's what's going to enable our survival here as well. I mean, so there aren't two external forces going on.
No, because the external forces that are used by America and Europe, these are interests. And Zionism is a value, not an interest. 98% of the Jews of Europe went west to the Western Europe and to the United States, because this is the nature. This is rationality. A Jewish state is irrational in terms of political interest and political nature, and the geopolitical nature. Therefore, the idea that we shall be dependent on United States, no. United States has its own interest, and a Jewish state is not one of its interests. So we can be friendly with them, because the forefathers of the United States felt that they are the new Joshua and new Bible, a new Zion. No, it won't work. If this is the way, Israel will be abolished within one generation. We cannot be here based on interest, but only on values. And that is the quarrel here now. Are we willing to sacrifice for values, or do we need to accept the interest of the rest of the world in order to keep us in the ghetto? And there is no solution to that, and this is biology. See, that's my field. Every organism is opposite to physics. Physics talks about atoms, collection of atoms. The organism is not. The organism is atoms that are connected in very strong social connections. And these are dictated by a text, and the text is the DNA. We Jews, we have a DNA. The DNA is the Jewish tradition. Without it, it's impossible to have a Jewish state. That's the error of the left. They have the illusion that they can continue the wonderful states that we have here, that was established by the first generation based on their Jewish identity. The second generation tried to destroy it and didn't succeed, and now they try to destroy it. But it can't work. It can't exist. Europe will not succeed, will not save us. America will not save it. In Yom Kippur War, America did not rescue us. We were alone. And I hate to hear that America helped us win the war. No. America helped us to rebuild the IDF, the Air Force, mainly the Air Force, after the war, after the first 3 weeks of the battles. We were alone, and we survived only due to the sacrifice of people from all ranges of the society. Everybody was there, not only the elite. The elite group did not win the war. It was the tank drivers and cannon operators in the tanks who won the war. These were the simple people. My company was everything in Israel. It represented the whole society, not any elite group. And nobody came to help us, and nobody will come to help us. If we succeed, if we fail, they will come and bring flowers to our tombstone. We don't want that. I rather get thorns from them now rather than flowers later. It is impossible to have a Jewish state without the DNA of the Jewish identity.
So here's a question, right? Because I mean, I talk about this all the time. You guys know it from watching the show, listening. I talk all the time about the incredible antagonism and hatred, really, that we see on the streets over the past 7 months towards all Jewish aspects of Israeli society. I mean, today there's people in the light rail in Tel Aviv who are handcuffing themselves to the trains to block them from traveling because they're not going to be operating on Shabbat, which, public transportation in Israel has never operated on Shabbat except in very certain municipalities. And so they're rioting over this, and every aspect really of Jewish identity of the state of Israel is under assault. I mean, that you had this weird attack where they vandalized and tried to start a riot outside and inside of the rabbinical courts in Kfar Saba, I think, a couple of months ago. I mean, all of the aspects that make Israel a Jewish state are now being directly attacked. You had an extraordinary anti-Semitic video of a bus last week where, women were singing into the ears of ultra-Orthodox Jews, knowing full well that they're not supposed to hear women's song. And you have these men, holding their ears like this, and you couldn't believe that this was happening in Israel and not in Ukraine. And here we had this, and this is what they're doing. They're openly hateful of the Jewish character of Israel. So this is just, you're saying it began really with the second generation. And the question is, what's going to happen with the third generation? Because these are the children and grandchildren of your colleagues from Yom Kippur War, and they were raised in this atmosphere of bitterness and antagonism towards Judaism.
The fact is that the process is that people who become more traditional is increasing and increasing, and it is independent of the demonstrations. The demonstrations really symbolize what I said earlier, that Oslo was against the Jewish state, the disengagement was to destroy the Jewish state, and the other actions with the court and everything else. Now, since there is no future for a secular Israeli non-Jewish state here, people understand it. And the offspring of the people who are demonstrating now will have to ask themselves the question, what are we doing here? And if they have no answers, they will not be here. Now, what I say is, now is the time for sitting together and looking for the joint vector, where we can go together and decide what is a Jewish state and what is a public arena of a Jewish state, not the private life of everybody else. Now, this is impossible now, because in order to be able to do that, we need two conditions. One is respect, mutual respect, and second, joint mission. We don't have it now. So we have to continue, because the majority of the Jews are with us, and this majority is growing. And it will grow, because every reasonable person understands that a non-Jewish state cannot survive here. And all the attempts to make peace and cheat everybody else won't work. Therefore, what I think we should continue with the government, ignore the demonstrations. The demonstrations are powered by anxiety of the people who have the fear of Jewishness. And they have only one way to solve the anxiety. First of all, to understand what is Jewishness, which they don't understand. And second, to understand that a non-Jewish state in Israel will be destroyed within one generation. And therefore, we should not surrender. We should not compromise. We should keep the principles and invite people to be discussing with us what is the common area of a Jewish state, and everybody in his home will do what he wants. If we can form a joint civil arena in which we shall be meeting from the two vectors and make them a joint vector, they have to accept our right to the right for our position. They have to respect us. They don't, and they have to accept that there is a mission for a Jewish state, which they don't have now. So they have no chance to succeed because they don't have DNA. It's biology explains it beautifully, because the Jewish people is an organism. We got the DNA in Sinai, and we are the only culture that continues for more than 3,000 years. It will not be destroyed now. We shall continue. And every other culture which does not have a DNA disappeared. And the secular Israeli culture, which is an imitation of the West, will not be surviving here. It's our responsibility not to surrender, but invite, not by compromise, but serious, respectful, define the joint mission and the joint vector. Then we can do it. Right now, with the current leadership of the demonstration, the only way to do it is to ignore, to continue, and to be confident that our way is correct one, because it has a future as a Jewish state, and then they will join us. No question about that. And the second change of generation, we have the third generation. This is a very important generation, and very important also that the people, the Jews who came from the Arab countries, made the change.
You know, it's interesting what you're saying, and obviously this is a very, very deep discussion. But you know, one of the things that I saw Elisha, as we had spoken in the past, of course, about you coming on and talking about the very remarkably prominent role that the veterans of 73 are playing in organizing, leading, and being sort of the fuel behind this spate of civil violence, really, and political warfare that we're seeing in the streets of Israel. And then you gave this Zoom video presentation last week in Hebrew, where you were also talking about it because Tucker Carlson interviewed this, I think, this European, maybe Swedish guy, Matthias Desmet, about mass psychosis. He wrote a book about mass psychosis, and it was relating, I think, largely to the COVID-19 things. And I had seen it when it came out in English, and it was subtitled into Hebrew, and so it made waves again, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so he talks about, you know, the formation of how you see sort of mass political psychosis when coming onto the street, and after the killing in Minneapolis of the black men in Minneapolis by the policemen. You had the whole Black Lives Matter riots that went through the United States in 2020, and so you have, which was a form of mass psychosis. People were hysterical about violence that doesn't exist. You look at the data, and police shootings of Black people are minuscule in comparison to the Black-on-Black deaths, particularly in places like Chicago, Minneapolis. But at any rate, it's totally irrational. And so much of what we're seeing now on the streets makes no sense. You can't have a conversation with the protesters about anything having to do with reality. And the leaders of this, again, your comrades from 73, Ehud Barak and others, they're talking about, they're encouraging this. They want this mass psychosis. They even said, you can overthrow a government with 5% of the people of the country unleashed against it. And they have this whole model of mass psychosis, of getting people to embrace this idea that's completely irrational, and then going forward in this hysterical rage, which is really what characterizes what we're seeing. So I'm a little bit less sanguine about the prospects, because if they're terrifying, I would assume, if they're not completely cynical, the politicians in the Knesset, you can't get to any sort of discourse today with Yair Lapid, with Benny Gantz, with anybody in their parties, because they're all terrified of the raving lunatics really on the street saying dictator, dictator, dictator when they're trying to repress democracy. Then they won't come to any agreements. They won't have any discussions that are substantive with the coalition about anything because they're too scared of the mobs in the streets.
Patience is the key. Patience is the key. Don't surrender. Now, the demonstrations are because of desperation. Now, as Matthias Desmet showed, it starts with anxiety. And anxiety is a loneliness of the modern man. But in Israel, there is another source of anxiety, which is bewilderness with what are we doing here. The crisis of Zionism is another source of anxiety. The first person who started it was Amos Oz in a book called Siach Lochamim. Yes, that was the first bird of this phenomenon.
Warriors coming together and talking about the war.
Why are we fighting? Now, this anxiety and the terror fighting us, the external forces are against us. So why are we doing it? Why are we here? This anxiety brings people to the street. And then they think that they form a community, a kehila. No, they form a herd, a lahaka. And this herd is controllable by the manipulators. And that's exactly what they do. They develop the anxiety by telling them, attack the Jewish symbols of Israel. The train that doesn't go on Shabbat. The Beit Din HaRabbani. What does it have to do? They went to, rabbinical court. They went to Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak didn't do anything with them. And that's exactly the point of this quarrel here. This is a desperation because we see that Israel is Jewish and we don't want a Jewish Israel. So what are we doing? We are a minority. They are the majority. This is what happens now. They will have to accept the fact that either they go away or they stay here with us and negotiate honestly with the majority of the people, because the process of becoming more traditional, more Jewish is stronger than anything else. And it will continue because every rational Jew asks himself, why are we in Israel? Why are we sacrificing in the fight against terror? And what is our mission here? Much simpler to be in New York. No, the best place is here. But in order for that to be, you have to have an external force, not part of nature. Not interest, but a value. And now we have a fight between the people of the interest and the people of the value. We shall win. No question about that.
I think you're right. I think you're right because I don't think that there's, they say the left, I don't know that they coined the term, but they popularized the term of war of no choice, that you don't have any choice but to fight it. And I think that what we're facing today is precisely that. It's a do or die moment. And I think you're absolutely right. The vast majority of Israelis, not only did they vote for this government, but they want Israel to be a Jewish state and they want it to survive. And I think that the more openly anti-Semitic, more openly antagonistic towards Judaism these protests become, and they're becoming unruly in their hatred of Jews, I think the more people who are not insane, the vast majority of Israelis are not, and have not become part of this mass psychosis that they've been developing, are going to walk away from that. I think we're seeing it more and more already, and I think that you're right, that this is just a process that started 50 years ago, and it's just we just have to get through it. There's no way to avoid it, and there's no way to reason with it, obviously. So I think that it's very valuable to be talking like this.
We are in the third generation. It's a different generation. It's a new generation. It's not part of the second generation that is now becoming old and is in depression and desperate and is out of and is psychotic. No, the new generation is much stronger and independent and wants to change. It wants Israel to be safe and safe and with self yes.
And
This
self-confidence.
generation
It's a,
things.
yeah,
By
I'm
the
just going to
way,
end it.
in
What's that?
biology, when we have a new creature, a new species, when either by genetic engineering or by mixing, we shall know whether it is a new organism only in the third generation. Same thing for the Zionist enterprise. We are now in the third generation.
No, it's
And
so
this
interesting. And I
generation
want to
will
just
decide.
I want to end with this, also transposing it just to the Bible. And I'll just say this because we've reached the end of our time. Is, we're about to finish reading the Torah cycle, and in the High Holy Days, we move on back to the book of Genesis. And there you have the story of a family, right? Of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 3 generations, and each one is another aspect. And one of the things that always strikes me also, because I made Aliyah on my own, so I identify sort of with Abraham, but the one who's really kind of the father of the people of Israel is Jacob. And and you go through, you have to go through Abraham to get to Isaac. You have to go through Isaac, who was so unsure and insecure in his mission that his father said he's not allowed to leave the land of Israel ever, right? Can't go. No, you can't leave under any circumstances. And it was only Jacob who left, came back, and left. And what does this mean? But had he succeeded, he succeeded to the point where his descendants, that we should never know this, were slaves. We should never, the 4th generation shouldn't experience this, but that it was enough to propel us forward into who we became and who we are today. So I think you're right. The most pivotal, the most important generation is the 3rd generation. We're seeing it arising now, and where it goes, like the story of Jacob, is going to determine the course of the future of the Jews. So thank you for your insights. I think it's extremely important, and yeah, I believe that it did all start in 73. Obviously, everything with the Jews started way before, but I mean, this is an extremely important story that we see unfolding, and I appreciate so much what you do, Elisha. Professor Haas, thanks for joining me, and I'm going to have you back soon.
Thank you for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Oh, and you guys, this is the last broadcast from the United States. Going home finally this afternoon, and we'll see you back in Israel later this week. So take care, and remember to subscribe to the Caroline Glick Show, and we'll see you later.